toward the end of the book. We're actually going to finish the book out today. And if this is your first week with us in a couple of weeks, or maybe your first time ever, first of all, let me say welcome. I'm glad you're here. If you're watching this one online on our YouTube channel or Facebook page, and this is the place that you started, let me just say welcome. I'm glad you're here. But this is the third part in a mini-series inside of a year-long series that we're doing called 43 for 52. And we've spent the last 3 weeks talking about Joseph. And the first two parts of this series, so the last two messages that we've done, we covered a total of 3 chapters in the book of Genesis. And tonight we're going to cover 11. So we're going to be here a while. Okay, good. Somebody's excited about that. 3 or 4 hours tops, all right? I think we can get it done in that amount of time. But so yeah, we're going to cover chapters 40 through 50 tonight. So chapter 40 is where we are going to begin. But just by way of quick recap for us as we think about Joseph, if you're not familiar with the story of Joseph, which most of us probably are, we started in chapter 37 a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about how this young kid, a 17-year-old kid, Joseph, was sold into slavery by his jealous brothers. They wanted to kill him, and then they thought better of it and decided just to sell him into slavery. And that was kind of the beginning of our story with Joseph. And we learned something. We've kind of broken these 3 weeks up into Joseph's early life, the middle part of his life, and then his later years. And the lesson that we learned from the early part of Joseph's life was that God's plan for your life involves a development process to get you from where you are to where you need to be in order to see God's plan fulfilled, right? And then last week, we talked about chapters 38 and 39 with Joseph, how a comparison between him and one of his brothers, Judah. And we talked about when Joseph was in slavery. He was working in the house of Potiphar, an Egyptian official, and Potiphar's wife came on to him, and he refused, and he kept his integrity, and he said no, and it cost him dearly. He went from being basically the head of the household and running everything in Potiphar's house to being thrown into prison, right? And that's where we left Joseph. And the lesson, our takeaway from last week, in the middle part of Joseph's life, was that integrity doesn't always lead to immediate reward, but it is going to position you for God's greater purpose in your life. And so we're going to pick up here where Joseph is now in prison. And you guys remember that for Joseph, it kind of feels like 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, right? He gets sold into slavery, he works his way up, and he's at this high level in Potiphar's house, and then he is unjustly, unfairly, and falsely accused, and now he finds himself in prison. His life is not going the way that he thinks it probably should, based on the dreams that he had and the authority that God showed him he would have. He's nowhere near that place in life. Well, now we get to chapter 40, and in prison, Joseph is given custody or care over 2 individuals in prison in chapter 40, the Pharaoh, or the king of Egypt, his baker, and his cupbearer. All right, so these two servants in Pharaoh's cabinet, basically, Pharaoh gets mad at them, he throws them in jail, and it's Joseph's job to watch over them and to care for them. And can you imagine being in Joseph's position here, right? Joseph is thinking, God gave me this dream. God gave me a vision of ruling over something, and that my brothers who are older than me, even my father, they're going to bow down before me. I know this is a vision from God, and yet here I am, a slave who has now been humiliated and falsely accused, and I'm in prison, and I'm serving other prisoners. Things are not looking good for Joseph here. But in his due diligence, going through his day-to-day tasks as he's going to do, he comes into the cupbearer and the baker, and they both seem very sad, right? And Joseph says, "Hey, what's the long faces, guys? Why are you so sad? What's happening?" And they said, "Well, we both had dreams that we don't really understand, and I can't make sense of it, and it's got me all frazzled. I don't know what to do with this." And Joseph said, "Well, God can make sense of your dream for you. Go ahead and tell it to me. So they tell him his dream. They each tell their dream. And Joseph interprets their dreams for them. And it doesn't go so well for the baker, right? You guys remember the story. I'm not going to take the time to read all 11 of these chapters. I'm going to summarize a lot of this. But he tells the baker, he said, well, your dream simply means that in 3 days from now, Pharaoh will raise your head up, clean off of your shoulders, and Pharaoh's going to kill you. And the cupbearer tells him his dream, probably reluctantly at this point, right? He tells him his dream, and Joseph says, well, you are going to be restored to your position, and you're going to get your role back as Pharaoh's cupbearer. He's going to find favor with you again. And he says, but when that happens, do me this favor. Remember me. Show kindness toward me, and remember that I helped you with this and I told you about this, and tell Pharaoh that I told you about this so that I can get out of prison, because I was kidnapped from my Hebrew land, which is a very interesting phrase that Joseph uses here, right? Kidnapped. Notice how he's even now he's not throwing his brothers under the bus. You notice that? He doesn't say, my brothers sold me into slavery. No, he says he was kidnapped. And so I was kidnapped, and even now I have not done anything to merit being in prison. So please tell Pharaoh about me. Well, you might have guessed how this ends up turning out. He forgets about him. It happens exactly as Joseph said it would. The baker is executed. The cupbearer is restored to his position, and he completely forgets. Now, this just blows my mind, right? Imagine being the cupbearer. You're in prison, and you've had this terrifying dream that's got you all shaken up, and someone explains a dream to you and says, hey, here's what's going to happen. You're going to be hanged, and you are going to have your position restored, and you're going to be right back where you were. And all I'm asking is that you tell Pharaoh, when he restores you, that you tell Pharaoh. 3 days later, 3 days. And the cupbearer forgets the whole thing. Wouldn't you think that if in 3 days, all of a sudden what that guy told me came true, that would be on the front of your mind? He said that exact thing would happen. And yet, he forgets. He did not remember Joseph. And 2 years later, we get to chapter 41. 2 years pass of Joseph still sitting in prison, being forgotten. And Pharaoh has a dream that he can't shake, that doesn't make sense to him. So he calls together all of his magicians, all of his counsel, all of his advisors, and not a one of them in the entire land of Egypt can make sense of this dream or this vision that Pharaoh has had. And it's at that time the cupbearer goes, uh-oh. There was something I was supposed to tell you a couple of years ago, and it has slipped my mind until just now, right? So he tells Pharaoh about it. So Pharaoh calls for Joseph and sends Joseph up to him. And Joseph comes in, and Pharaoh says, I've had this dream. I'm told you can interpret it. And Joseph, being the humble man that he is, goes, no, I can't interpret that dream for you. But God can. Like we recognize that as humility, but at the same time, we kind of hate that guy, don't we? You all know somebody like that when they're like, well, I didn't do it. It was God. You know what I mean, right? Like Pharaoh's probably going, whatever, just let me tell you the dream and make sense of this for me, right? So he tells Joseph the dream, and Joseph explains. He says, what your dream means, it's actually relatively simple. It means the land of Egypt is going to have 7 years of excess. Following that 7 years of excess, you're going to have 7 years of severe famine. So Pharaoh, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but if it were me, I would put a wise person in charge who can oversee setting aside a chunk of what you get in that excess over these next very flourishing years so that you can make it through the famine that's going to come after that. And Pharaoh is absolutely pleased by this. He loves this. He's like, this guy just explained everything. Why would I not put him in charge? None of my advisors could make sense of this. And here's this Hebrew prisoner. He made sense of it right away. There's nobody in the land like him. In fact, Pharaoh even says, why wouldn't I this guy clearly has the Spirit of God on him. Why wouldn't I put him in charge? And so we see the journey of Joseph being partially complete now, going from a 17-year-old kid who was tossed into a pit to then going into a prison, and now he is working for the king of Egypt in his palace. In fact, Pharaoh says, you will be over everyone in the entire land. You're going to run the entire nation. I'm the only one who's going to have a place over you. Which do you ever think that at that time, Potiphar and his wife went, uh-oh. Can you imagine they woke up and saw the paper that morning and was like, Joseph is now my boss? The guy that I put in prison, or the guy that I falsely accused of misconduct, that now he's my boss. How much you want to bet they packed up and moved to another country, right? They didn't stick around. But now Joseph is in charge. And being in charge, he does exactly what Joseph does, right? We talked about that last week with Potiphar. Everything that he touched turned to gold. Everything flourished because God was with Joseph. And the same thing happens here. Egypt got more powerful. Egypt expanded. It got more wealthy. They stockpiled everything that they needed to do. And then 7 years later, we see this severe famine hit, just as Joseph said that it would. And everybody in the surrounding communities, their crops are dying, their livestock are dying because of this famine. And so everybody knows, hey, Egypt has all the goods. We got to go do some business in Egypt. And among those who knew this were Jacob and his sons. And Jacob says, listen, you guys, I've heard that Egypt has grain and livestock, and they have everything that we need. So you guys pack up, go to Egypt, buy some supplies for us. Sure thing, Dad, no problem. So they pack up, they head off to Egypt, where they come into, I'm guessing they get in the line to buy the grain out of the storehouses. And as they're doing that, something very, very interesting happens, doesn't it? Joseph, who is overseeing this entire operation for the country, sees these 10 men who come in and bow down before him as a tribute or as a gesture of recognizing his place of authority and wanting to buy some grain from him. And at that moment when they bow down, Joseph recognizes who they are. Now remember, this has been a long, long time. In fact, if we follow the math that the Bible lays out for us, there's a 22-year period from the time that they sold him into slavery to this moment. 22 years have passed. And when they bow down before Joseph, Joseph remembers his brothers, and he remembers the vision that God gave him of his brothers bowing before him, that 22 years earlier has now come to completion. Joseph recognized his brothers, but they didn't recognize him, right? And so Joseph trying to, this is one of my favorite parts, because Joseph starts playing some games, if I'm being honest. I really think that's what he's doing. So he begins by speaking harshly to him, because they didn't recognize him, and I don't think he wanted them to recognize. So he starts speaking harsh. He's like, you guys are spies. What are you doing here? Why are you have come to see if we're weak so that you can go back and tell your country and then they can come attack us? And they're like, no, we just want to buy some grain. And he's like, I don't believe it. Tell me your whole story. So they start telling him, well, we have one other brother with our father at home. We had a brother who's dead now, but our youngest brother stayed at home. And so Joseph wants to play a game. He's like, I don't believe you. This brother, you stay here in my prison until the rest of you go get the younger brother and prove to me you're not lying. And he sends the rest of them away. And they go home and they tell Jacob what had happened. We met this jerk who kept Simeon in prison. And he says the only way he'll let him go is if we bring Benjamin back, the youngest one, who is now Jacob's favorite. He's kind of replaced Joseph as the favorite. He's Joseph's true full brother. The rest of them are all half brothers. Benjamin is Joseph's true full brother. He said, bring him back and prove that we have a younger brother, and then he'll let our older brother go. And Jacob's like, I can't do that. I can't lose Benjamin. Well, I mean, you're losing one of your other sons. So he's in this predicament, right? And he's trying to figure things out. And so he finally figures it out. Okay, fine. I will let him go. And you know how he lets him go? This is what's really, really interesting compared to what we talked about last week. It was Judah who convinced him. Judah, the one that we talked about last week, who had moral failing after failing after failing, and his family was a mess. He has returned home. Remember, he had his breaking point. He hit rock bottom last week. He has now returned home, and now he is telling Jacob, hey, listen, Dad, you can blame me if anything happens to Benjamin. I promise on my life I will bring Benjamin back to you. Jacob reluctantly says, okay, and he sends him off. And so the whole family goes back to Egypt. And once they're back in Egypt, they meet Joseph, and Joseph meets Benjamin and finally gets to meet his younger brother again. And then they say, okay, fine, here's all the grain you need, here's all your supplies, best of luck to you. And he sends them back on their way to Canaan, back to their father. But as he did, he snuck his personal silver cup, his favorite coffee mug, put it inside of Benjamin's luggage. And he waits until they're off the road, and then he sends his guards to go get them and say, hey, they stole my cup. So they go, they track him down, they stop him, they say, why would you steal? This guy, with this leader in Egypt was so kind to you, he was helpful to you, he gave you all the supplies you needed, and then you go and steal from him. And they're like, we didn't steal from him. And they search their stuff, and they find that cup in Benjamin's bag. So they arrest Benjamin. And they bring all of them back to Joseph. And Judah begins pleading, and they again, 2 more times, it says the brothers bowed down before Joseph. So we get 3 explicit mentions of the brothers bowing before Joseph, right? And Judah is pleading with Joseph, please don't lock him up. Lock me up instead, because if you lock Benjamin up, you're effectively killing my father. It will put my father in his grave. Lock me up instead. Let Benjamin go. And this is too much for Joseph. At this point, Joseph breaks, and he kicks everybody out of the room, and he tells them, I'm Joseph. I'm your brother that you sold to Egypt. And it says he cried like a baby. He cried so loud, all the Egyptians outside the room could hear him crying. Can you imagine that? Somebody as powerful as Joseph, and then you're outside the room, you do anything that guy says because he has the authority to have your head chopped off if he just wants to, and you hear him bawling like a baby. Your ear's going to the wall, isn't it? Like you want to know what's happening. And Joseph tells his brothers, I am your brother Joseph. And of course, they are absolutely shocked. They have no words. They don't know what to say. They can't fathom that this has happened. And look at what he says in chapter 45. Brothers, please come near. And so they came near. I am Joseph, your brother, the one you sold into Egypt. Now, don't be grieved. Don't be angry with yourself. God has sent me ahead of you to preserve life. And as if that wasn't enough, he reiterates, God sent me ahead of you to establish you as a remnant within the land. And then he reiterates a 3rd time, to keep you alive by great deliverance. Therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. 3 times he says God did the action with a specific outcome in mind. You meant this to happen one way. But the whole time, you weren't actually the one that was doing all of this. You weren't pulling the strings. God has planned all of this for a very particular purpose. And that's what we learn from the latter part of Joseph's life. This is a takeaway for us from this, that God is already writing redemption into the chapters that you haven't lived yet. Those moments of pain, those things that you have experienced that are like life-altering things, those setbacks that you encounter, when you encounter those, it is encouraging to us to recognize that those things did not catch God by surprise. In fact, he had already been writing out his plan before you ever even knew it was a thing. Before that struggle ever came up to you and you're going, what am I going to do? I didn't see this coming. How am I going to get through this? God, why would you let this happen to me? God has already had a plan in place. Joseph, no doubt, in the years that he spent in prison and in slavery, had to wonder, why is this happening? This is not what I saw going the way that I had envisioned my life going. But now he's able to recognize, oh, this was God working through this entire thing, this entire time. He is already writing redemption into the chapters that we have not yet lived. And I think the same can be said of us. We don't have to know what God is doing in our pain or with our experiences. We just have to have the faith that He is already using those experiences for His purposes before they even happen. And Joseph gets this unique insight here to where he recognizes that his brothers did this action, and yet it was God who was working behind the scenes the entire time. There's something comforting for us in that, right? That we know that whenever those struggles are that we're facing, that the outcome of those struggles, that God has already had a hand in that from the beginning. So he sends his brothers back and says, go get Dad. In fact, Pharaoh heard from the other Egyptians who were there. They went and told Pharaoh, these are Joseph's brothers, his long-lost brothers. He's been reunited with them, and Pharaoh thinks it's fantastic. He's like, that's awesome. Go get the rest of your family. Bring them all here. I'll give them the best land in Egypt. They can eat the fattest cows. They can have whatever they want. Joseph, you have saved our entire nation, so your family gets carte blanche to do whatever they want to do. Go get your dad. Bring him back here. And so they do. And Jacob is reunited with his thought-dead son of over 2 decades. He gets to meet his son again, his grown son. And he lives out the remainder of his days a happy man with his entire family. And then Jacob dies in his old age. They return him to the land of Canaan to be buried with his fathers. And when they do, a thought strikes the brothers. Is it possible that Joseph has just kind of been nice to us for Dad's sake? What if now that Jacob is dead, what if now that our father is dead, now Joseph's going to seek revenge on us? And this is where we get the famous line, Joseph's most famous line in the entire story arc of Joseph. In chapter 50, Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You planned evil against me. God planned it for good to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. Those words from Joseph, they echo throughout the entire rest of the Bible. And this is why this is such a critical verse for us to understand, because when Joseph says this, he is not just describing what is happening in their situation. He's actually describing the entire story of the Bible. All of the little stories that make up the big story of the Bible, this is it. This is the heart of the entire redemptive message in the Bible. What you meant for evil, God meant for good. You see this pattern in the stories that we have already looked at in our 43 for 52 series. What Adam and Eve meant for evil, God meant for good. What Noah's generation meant for evil, right? Their every thought was bent toward wickedness. What they meant for evil, God meant for good. What Abram and Sarai meant for evil, God meant for good. And what Joseph's brothers meant for evil, God meant for good. And then you can keep moving forward. What Saul meant for evil for David, God meant for good. Solomon, Daniel, Jeremiah, the list goes on and on. We can keep looking at all of these characters who had experienced evil or who committed evil. And all of these stories, God is not surprised one time. He is never caught off guard by their evil. When people plan evil, God is already at work with a greater plan, not just to save lives, but to write his entire redemption into our history. And now this is where I think the story of Joseph gets so interesting, all right? So stick with me on this. the parallels that we see, and this is why we arranged this entire series to fit a part of the story of Joseph on Easter Sunday, okay? Because the parallels of Joseph really, really, really mimic another biblical character. And I bet you can't guess who I'm talking about, right? Let's take a look at this, just bullet points of the story of Joseph, all right? So he was deeply loved by his father. He was betrayed by those closest to him. He was sold for silver by Judah. He was falsely accused and punished. He remained faithful in his suffering. He was raised to a position of glory. He forgave those who wronged him, and he provided life for others. That's the story of Joseph, right? But that story is a shadow of a greater story in the Bible. Let's run back through that exact same list. Jesus was deeply loved by his Father. He was his beloved Son, his only begotten. He was betrayed by those closest to him, right down to the detail of being sold for pieces of silver by Judas, which is the Greek name of the Hebrew name Judah. Interesting detail. He was falsely accused and he was punished. He remained faithful in his suffering. He was raised to a position of glory. He forgave the very ones who wronged him, and he provided life for many. The parallels are uncanny, are they not? We see that same story arc in Jesus. When Joseph says what others meant for evil, God meant for good, Peter's sermon at Pentecost echoes this exact same mentality. In chapter 2 of the book of Acts, Peter says, "Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and signs and wonders that God did through him in your midst. You know him yourselves, this Jesus. He was delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. You crucified him and killed him by the hands of lawless men. God raised him up." You catch the similarities of what Peter says and what Joseph had said. According to God's definite plan. God was not surprised by what happened. You had him killed, but God raised him up. You meant for evil, but God meant for good. What the brothers meant for evil against Joseph, God meant for good. What the Jewish leaders meant for evil against Jesus, God meant for good. But what does that word meant mean? Right? It's like what the definition of is. For those of you who are older than 40 and remember that. What does that word meant mean? Well, it means, some of your translations will say meant. Some of your translations may say what God planned for good, right? Meant or planned. It's a Hebrew word that it has a lot of different meanings. In fact, we see this word dozens of times in the Bible, and it has a wide range of meanings, from simply thinking about something to planning something out ahead of time to scheming and plotting something, all the way up to being very intentionally artistic in designing something. This is the same word in the book of Exodus when Moses is relaying the instructions on designing the temple and the altar and the priestly attire that the priests would wear when they would make sacrifices. And he would say, you need to take red threads and purple and blues, and you have to intricately weave them together. It's the same word. And I think that's really, really interesting. That Joseph says and I think there's some wordplay happening here, which is very common in Hebrew literature, right? That you would use a similar word or a same word that has a couple of different meanings as a way of contrasting one versus the other. And I think what Joseph is saying is what you were scheming for to happen, which was evil, God was weaving something beautiful out of it. And here's a couple of things I want you to recognize in that statement from Joseph. One, this was not something that the brothers did by accident, nor is this something that we as humanity do by accident. We are not behaving wickedly by accident. It is intentional. There is responsibility, human responsibility in our sin and in our brokenness. What you meant for evil, that there is an intentionality behind this, that we schemed, we plotted, we desired evil things. That was on purpose. But also, it was not simply a reaction to those wicked things from God. God does not simply respond to our wickedness, right? Sometimes maybe we get this concept in our head that, yeah, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. So God waited for you to take action. You did something wrong, and then God went, oh, I better step in here and fix this. And then he jumps in, he reacts to it, and he corrects it, and he moves things back into the path that he wants things to go, right? That's not at all how the Bible describes God's interaction with humanity. What we mean for evil, what we intend for evil, God is already working a plan. He is already threading things together in such a way that it accomplishes what he wants. He is not simply sitting around thinking about, oh man, I need a plan B now. I better change, I better alter how this is going because they did this and that's not what I wanted, so now I got to change my plan and I got to... That's not how God responds. God is already working out his plan. He is intricately crafting an artful design. Pretty cool, isn't it? Humanity had evil intent, but God is weaving together a perfect, redemptive masterpiece. Joseph isn't just saying, well, you guys did this, but then God had a better plan, and so he just inserted that one instead. No, the whole time God is at work. God wove into this story a lifeline for an entire nation. What they had meant to simply take a life. God is at work through the whole thing. Redemption doesn't just erase evil, right? God just doesn't remove all of the consequences and just start things with a blank slate in terms of our consequences of humanity and its brokenness. But he sure does write a better ending, doesn't he? Man, isn't that a great thought for us on Easter, that we don't have to think about our past, our evilness, those things that we intentionally desired instead of God, our sinful brokenness, that it's not just erased, but that there is a better story attached to it. That we have a better ending because God is at work in us than if we had been left to ourselves. This is what the resurrection of Jesus reminds us of, that God writes the best endings through the stories that we thought were ruined. He did it with Joseph. Here's Joseph, a Hebrew slave / prisoner who had been forgotten. Pretty bleak story. You might even think the story is over. And then God turns it around. Every single Bible character that we study, you can find a similar arc in their story like this. But the crucifixion of Jesus is the ultimate one in this story, right? Jesus is the greater Joseph. He was betrayed, yet he was forgiving. He was rejected, yet he was redeeming. He was innocently suffering, yet he offers life to the very ones who wronged him. Joseph's story shows us that what others meant for evil, God meant for good. And it reveals how God threads redemption through betrayal and suffering and loss, not by removing the pain, not by erasing it from our memories. A lot of times not even by changing our circumstances altogether, but by giving it purpose. Because he's been threading something together the whole time. But Joseph's story only points to something greater, someone greater. And Jesus didn't just endure suffering like Joseph did. Jesus took it to completion. and he more completely did what Joseph couldn't, what Abraham couldn't, what Adam couldn't. He defeated death. And that is where the story of Easter declares that if Christ had not been raised from the dead, in Corinthians chapter 15, Paul says, if Christ had not been raised from the dead, then your faith is worthless. Circle that word, worthless. Because if there is no resurrection, then everything that we are doing is completely pointless. In fact, Paul goes so far as to say, if the resurrection didn't happen, we are the biggest fools on the planet. Without the resurrection, Jesus is not the Christ. Jesus is not God. He is not who he said he is. And if we are believing someone to be God and they clearly are not because they didn't rise from the dead, how dumb are we? The resurrection is not just part of the story. The resurrection is the story. Without the resurrection, none of this makes sense. And Joseph is just another feel-good story. Even Jesus is just another feel-good story with an unfortunate ending. And they're no better than the heroes that we like to read about in our other fictional stories. He's really no better than Frodo Baggins or Tony Stark or any other character that you might think of, right? Without the resurrection, that's all it is. But man, what if the resurrection is true? Well, then we have a completely different story, don't we? We have someone who claimed to be God, who proved it by coming back from the dead and declaring victory over death. And that is what we celebrate. And if that's what we're celebrating, if we are celebrating someone who can do that, then all of the stories that we've been reading about over the last couple of months, and we're going to continue reading about over the next several, all of those stories are pointing to this one person who is a greater version, or theologians would call him a greater type of the Messiah character than themselves. And I think that's exactly what we see in Joseph. We have a great picture, a foreshadowing of who the Messiah will be and some of the qualities that we will see in the Messiah, but in a far more perfect sense. Without the resurrection, your faith is just wishful thinking. But Christ has been raised. And that changes everything for us. It confirms that God does write the best endings when things seemed completely hopeless. When Jesus was hung on a cross and executed and laid into a cold, quiet tomb, everything seemed broken. Everything seemed hopeless. It seemed like the story was over. But God meant it for good. He had planned and orchestrated through the entire thing a redemptive plan unlike anything we could have possibly fathomed. And it's a story that we get to be a part of because Jesus is risen. The cross tells us that we're broken, but the tomb is what tells us that we're redeemed. So I want us to recognize tonight we're going to take a moment to observe the Lord's Supper together. So as our team comes to prepare us for that, I want us to reflect on this for a moment, to think that what God has, or what others have meant for evil, what our humanity has meant for evil, God used for good. And we remember that Joseph forgave his brothers and invited them to his table, not to punish them, but to feed them, to restore them, and to be with them. And Jesus, who is the greater Joseph, does the same for us. He invites us to his table. And so Ian is going to come and lead us through that moment together.